New and interesting uses of carrots. I love it. Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So this week is the final week of our 6-part series about restoring our connection with an unhurried God. We've really kind of made quite an arc during the last 6 weeks, kind of getting ready for the busyness of fall, starting with week 1 where we're looking at the yoke of God, Jesus' observation that his yoke is easy, his burden is light, and how that's one of the ways we can tell whether we need to be adjusting our lives or not, whether we experience life on a regular basis, that ease, that lightness of being, or not. The second week, we got into the hope of God, looking at that passage that drives everybody crazy from Mary and Martha, and noting that if you really want to keep hope alive in your life, you got to pay attention to the main thing, keep the main thing the main thing. And oftentimes when we simply are absorbed in all the trees of the forest, we fail to step back and see the beauty and grandeur and where we're being called to in our lives. That third week, we looked at the assurance of God in Psalm 23, and that deep understanding that if you really integrate that knowledge that with the Lord as your shepherd, you shall not want, that not only does that awareness lead you beside still waters and calm pastures, but also through the shadow of darkness where you feel no despair, and it sets up a table before you in the presence of your enemies, not merely in their absence. That next week we looked at the pleasure of God, and Jesus is noting that it is God's good pleasure to give us good and wonderful things in this life, not simply through working really, really hard and hoping that at the end of life or in the next life we have those things. He told us to focus our lives on their loving relationships, building love between people. That's the way we create purses in heaven, he said. Although when he was talking about heaven, he was talking about our experience of heaven in the here and now. That love that we create and that we experience on this earth never goes away. Not even death takes away any kind of love that is created here. Then the next week we looked at the seasonality or rhythm of God, using that Ecclesiastes 3 passage that the Byrds sang so well back in the 60s about everything changes, it has its seasons, and noting that if we don't pull back from the fray and note the energies, the flow of energy in our lives and also in the wider sphere, we can end up doing the right thing but at the wrong time and experience life kind of like planting tomatoes in Nebraska in January. Right thing to do but wrong timing. And so paying attention to the rhythm and flow of life is really helpful, and you don't really get a sense until you connect with this unhurried God. We also noted at the end of that last week, and by the way, if you didn't see the sermon or read it, I rarely do this, but I really recommend it from last week. It was a kind of important sermon, I think. You can just get it up on YouTube or a printed copy. But at the end of the sermon, I was noting that really when we look at the seasonality, the ebb and flow of human civilization, we're in a pretty interesting time right now that we need to be aware of. I mean, now that we've democratized the instruments of mass destruction and also are throwing all kinds of things into the atmosphere and really putting the earth into jeopardy, God is raising up energy now in this season really to help save the future of human civilization. And if we're not aware of that, if we're not tapped into that energy, we really should be, and we should be leveraging that which is coming into existence right now. This week, we end, perhaps that's a good segue actually, into ending with the sovereignty of God. Let's hear from our scripture passages.
From Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And from the Gospel of Mark, the 2nd chapter. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak, otherwise the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts a new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost. So are the skins. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God, where Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. And then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath.'"
So in the mid-12th century, the famous Rabbi Maimonides, who probably was feeling a bit tired, decided to count all of the requirements, all the commandments given in the Jewish Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. He went through the whole Torah, counting each commandment, listing them out carefully, and you know how many commandments he found that are called to be followed? More than 100, more than 300. There are actually 613 commandments in the Torah. That's a lot to keep track of. Now, you put these into categories, and you notice that they really fall into 2 general categories. There are positive commandments, positive commandments being those things we are commanded to do, of which there are 365. And then there are negative commandments, that is, things we are commanded not to do, of which there are 248. And the rabbis of that era were noticing the numbers of that, the significance of the numbers. 365, of course, corresponds to the days of the solar calendar. So the heavens are kind of invoked in that. They also noted that 248 is significant because there are 248 bones and major organs in the human body. Now, there are 206 bones in the human body. That's pretty cut and dried. It's subject to a little interpretation, which organs are major and which aren't. And you kind of got to give the rabbis a break. They weren't surgeons, right? But they were really trying to make a point, a larger point, not a surgical point. And that is that they saw in the laws, really they were meant to create harmony and maintain harmony between the heavens and the earth, the solar calendar, the human body, the heavens and the earth, between God and humanity, that even the restrictive laws were meant to lead, therefore, to a fullness of life, not simply some arbitrary, restriction or repression of life. So the laws, they felt, were a good and beautiful thing. Now, I must confess, laws may be good and beautiful, but trying to follow 613 of them, that gets a bit unwieldy, right? Well, happily for us in the modern world, a whole lot of those commandments are literally impossible to follow in the modern world. So if you actually go back and recount what we can actually do in our era, there are only 171. And 26 of those you can only follow if you live in the land of Israel. So lucky us. 145. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't have that great a memory, and even 145 is a little hard to keep track of. Happily for us in the Torah, God essentially gives us a cheat sheet, lists actually just 10 central commandments, out of which all of the rest are really meant to flow. Remember these 10 in essence, and keep those 10, and you're doing pretty well. The rest flow from those things. Just remember the 10. Yeah. Remember the 10. How many commandments can you remember of those 10? Can we maybe get a little Jeopardy music or something going? Let's just set the counter for 60 seconds. See how many of those 10 you can remember. Hopefully you can remember the commandments a little better than you can remember Jeopardy. Okay, well, how many got all 10, by the way? Ooh, you see, you're not alone. Then you'll good. Steph Sacco got all 10. Good. Well, if you didn't get all 10, give yourself a break. First of all, somebody got extra credit at the 9 o'clock service. They noticed that the Roman numeral 4 is misdone there. Another person got extra credit because they came out and said, the original tablets didn't have Roman numerals anyway. I really let her down when I noted that this wasn't the original tablets. These were. But let's just see how many of these let's just actually call these 10 to mind. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, in some traditions, they also count the preface to the 10 commandments as part of that. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. Second commandment is this: you shall not make for yourself a carved or graven image. Third, you shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. Remember that when the Huskers lose, will you? Fourth, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. 5, honor your mother. Oh, there you go. Honor your father and your mother. Now, these first 5 have been seen in the tradition as ways we express and respond to our love of God. Even the father and mother, that's part of actually the way we respond to our love for God and God's love for us. The second 5 have to do with how we act out our love for each other. So it's number 6, you shall not murder, not a very loving thing to do. You shall also not commit adultery. 8 is you shall not steal. 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, a good thing for every politician to bear in mind these days. And 10? What was the 10th? What's the 10th one? Oh, I heard it, covet, yes. You shall covet. No, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Those are the 10 commandments. Now, curiously, of that list of 10, there's pretty widespread agreement in modern times in our country that they are truly, really good commandments. Aside from, there's 1 or 2 that we really think, at least in practice, are more suggestions, aren't there? Take, for instance, that third commandment: do not take the name of the Lord in vain. And it's not just about Huskers games when they lose. That was never meant as a commandment not to swear. I mean, that was really not high on God's list, I don't think. The name of the Lord in vain has to do with power, purpose. The idea is, do not take God's purposes in vain. Do not take God's purposes for your life lightly. Now, we could explore that this morning at length, but we already explored that commandment actually in the last series this summer. It wasn't called the third commandment. It was called the 7 commitments of the Christian life. That's how we take God's purposes for our lives seriously. We covered 6 of them and said there's a mystery 7th that will be revealed this fall, and more to be revealed later this fall. But there's another one that we tend to take as a mere suggestion. That is that 4th commandment. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. We may slow down on the weekends a bit, and some of us may even do what we're doing here this morning, show up for church, but for an hour or so. But we just hit the ground running, don't we? The rest of the day. I mean, just zoom, zoom, zoom. Not really what was intended as Sabbath keeping. Now, in former years in the country, that Sabbath keeping was taken more seriously in some respects. Remember those blue laws from our history, particularly in the 1800s. They created all kinds of blue laws around the country. Some of them had to do with sincerely desiring to keep that Sabbath holy, and some of them had more to do with making sure that certain groups in America that the majority culture didn't feel was acceptable were discriminated against, like Jews and Seventh-day Adventists who take the Sabbath on Saturday. Well, so we made the blue laws for Sunday. But there were some sincere, perhaps, attempts to try to at least forbid practices that were seen to be unbecoming of Sabbath keeping in the United States. Even clear till 1985, in fact, in Texas, it was illegal to sell skillets and pots and pans and housewares, washers and dryers, all illegal. Not supposed to do work on the Sabbath, and that just encourages that. I remember in my Princeton days in New Jersey, you couldn't buy a car on the Sabbath or trade one. That's illegal. In fact, that still is illegal in New Jersey and a number of other states. That's a blue law that continues on the books. But aside from that, really, not much attention paid to Sabbath keeping. What's curious to me is oftentimes is like sometimes we actually appeal to Jesus himself when we don't pay a lot of attention to the Sabbath. I mean, that passage this morning that we heard, Jesus is and his disciples are out walking along the side of a field, and some of his disciples take some grain and they're rubbing them to take the chaff off the grain, and the Pharisees get all up in their faces about that, and Jesus is like, hey, relax. And he mentions that the Sabbath was created for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. So it's for us. And so that's all well and good, but oftentimes we take that to mean, well, therefore we just kind of do whatever we please on the Sabbath, right? Well, we don't need a commandment telling us to do whatever the heck we want to do, right? And that wasn't Jesus' point. Jesus wasn't trying to do away with Sabbath observance. He was trying to do away with the intense legalism and pettiness that surrounded Sabbath observance in his day. He was trying to take down this fence that had been built up around the law that prevented people from really tapping into the spirit of it. That fence around the law was actually a rabbinic practice. It's something they intentionally set up. It was known as the fence around the law. If there was a critical law, like one of the Ten Commandments, what they would do, they would then create all kinds of stricter requirements, stricter commandments than the original, so that if you kind of maintained that fence, if you walked around that fence, you were fine. If you accidentally broke that fence, if you actually broke one of those stricter commandments, you didn't actually break the core commandment. That's why there are 613 laws in the Torah. They were building fences around the central 10 commandments to make sure that none of us would break them. So it's amazing we take them some of these so lightly. When they took them very seriously. Jesus was just as serious about this, but he said, you got to recognize the spirit behind the commandment. If your stomach is rumbling and you're hungry, how much are you connecting to this unhurried God? It's better to open a fence in that, open a gate in that fence, and eat. The rabbi said, no, you can't rub grain because you might accidentally be caught up in threshing of grain. That's work. That was the fence. You don't even rub it in your hands. It only leads to other things, right? So, Jesus took the Sabbath very seriously. And part of the reason we know that is because there's so many times in the Gospels where we hear where he is even just off alone, even praying all night, even in prayer. The Sabbath was about taking a full 24 hours of your life and praying and playing. That's the gist of it. Praying and playing. You reflect, you worship, you give thanks, and you have fun, too. I mean, isn't it like the greatest thing in the world that part of the 10 commandments, God could choose any commandment, and God said 10. One of those commandments is actually about us having fun. We're commanded to let our hair down a bit, to relax, to enjoy a full day, every week, a full 24 hours, praying and playing. And that's it. What we learn when we start to do that, we start to, there's all those multiple intelligences. We're so focused on the logical, strategic mind all week long, doing our doing, and then we pray and we play, and we start making use of all those other intelligences that we've been neglecting during the week that are more related to that other side of the brain that's been dormant for much of the time. So it's actually a way of creating a super high intelligence and intuition. We start to really tap into that seasonality. We start to notice the energies that ebb and flow, both in our personal lives, in our family lives, in our community, even in our world. We start to then be able to leverage those energies, planting figurative tomatoes in season rather than in January. All those, putting our energies at the right time, at the right place, rather than the wrong place. That's what Sabbath keeping is meant to do. It's meant for our benefit. It's not the product of some arbitrary God who could just hardly wait for us to break one of these commandments so that God could strike us down with lightning or something. I remember in late high school, I used to meet with my minister every week. We'd get together and we'd just spend time in conversation. I was trying to wrap my mind around this life of faith, and I just had these kind of intuitions about calling into ministry, and it was kind of freaking me out, and there's a lot of problems I had with Christianity, and I wanted to know what I was getting into. And I remember one day talking about this mean, grumpy Gus God of the Old Testament who just had all these arbitrary laws and just seeming for no reason. And I mentioned the Ten Commandments, and he told me a story that changed my whole view on that. He told me a story about a man who'd come into him, who remained unnamed years ago, who was having an adulterous affair. And the man had come in noting that he was actually kind of surprised that he and his mistress, they were having a great time together. They weren't being struck down by lightning. There was no cosmic hammer. There was no calamity that was befalling them, unexplainable other than by the hand of God. They were having a wonderful time, and in fact, he was falling in love with her. He thought, there is no God that's up there to punish us. These commandments aren't so. Why? What's their purpose? The problem, though, was he was in to meet with this minister, who was Bruce Van Blair, who some of you know, for a reason. And the reason was because, he had fallen in love with this mistress, and he was still in love with his wife and his family, and had no intention of dissolving that marriage or dissolving that relationship. And so, yet now he was trying to follow the commitments of two loves, and that doesn't work so well. He was tearing his life apart, in fact. And I finally got it. These commandments are not arbitrary. They're meant to protect us. They're not meant to repress our desires for love and intimacy. They're actually meant to nourish and protect our love and intimacy. They're there for our good. Consequently, breaking them does not cause God to want to hit you with a hammer. No, it causes God to say, hey, when are you going to let up on yourself and the other people in your life? When are you going to get happier again? When are you going to get your loves aligned? When are you going to make use of the full energies of life rather than limping around like you're doing? That's what these commandments are about. So, isn't it interesting that we have these 10, and there is no weighting behind them. There's no okay, this one's worth 90 points, this one's 35 points, this one's 50. There's no kind of weighting. There's no apparent ordering of priority other than those kind of two great divides, how we express our love for God and our neighbor. But that's it. They're all treated as if they're exactly equal in weight and importance, which gets kind of uncomfortable when you think about it. In other words, Sabbath keeping, failing to keep the Sabbath, is put on the same level as, murder. Really? Sabbath keeping, failing to do that is as corrosive to our lives as murdering someone? Well, before you think that's just completely cockeyed, there are some differences between the two. However, think about it. If you are constantly on the go and you are never taking the time that is commanded of you, the 24 hours every week to do this, if you think you and your work are so important and that the world must revolve around you and what you do so much that you will completely disobey this commandment, who are you killing? You're killing yourself. And it doesn't always just stop with us either. When we begin to orient our hearts around something other than God and responding in love to God, where is it oriented? We start defining ourselves less as children of God as by what we do and what we produce and what we consume. And where does that get us? Not only starts eroding our own lives, but it's also eroding the lives of people all over the world. When we look the other way at the sweatshops in the third world countries and so forth, in order to get our shirts on sale at Kmart, it's all tied together. Or when we willfully put the earth in jeopardy, all so we can have more stuff. We've defined ourselves by what we produce and consume. Yeah, Sabbath keeping, murder, they're not as dissimilar as we think. Now, having said that, I don't mean to put everybody on a guilt trip. Murderers, murderer. No. I mean, if you trip up on one or two of these, the thing is that there is no God who is waiting to hit you with a hammer for it. There is no God who is just waiting to exercise God's wrath towards you. As the old saying goes, we are not punished for our sins. We are punished in our sin. God doesn't hit us with a hammer. We hit ourselves with a hammer. God's saying, stop. Quit hurting yourself. I have a better way. Pull back from the fray. Get a sense of defining yourself through being rather than doing. Get a sense of the forest for the trees, the ebb and flow, the seasonality of life. The way we are so constantly even aware of how much we are surrounded by God when we just simply take those 2 minutes at the beginning of every worship service, where have you given and received love? Imagine every day, of one day, full day of the week, devoted to deepening that awareness. When we fail to keep the Sabbath, we are essentially, to put it bluntly, sending up a signal to God, to the universe, to life itself, that we know what we're doing better than God knows what God's doing. That the world revolves around us, not God. And because these commandments are about blessing, not about simply arbitrary rule following, we're also sending up a signal that we really don't want to receive the blessings that God intends for us. That's the signal that we are sending every week when we fail to take that time to pray and to play. Is that the signal you want to be sending? If to no other person than yourself? If that's not the signal you want to be sending, I have just a modest proposition for you. Just take the next 3 months, kind of a try before you buy philosophy. If you've been having a hard time keeping the Sabbath, taking that 24 hours, choose one day. By the way, 3 months, that's really, just commit to that, to say, I'm not saying I'm going to do this for all eternity. I'm just going to try 3 months. So, in other words, you're not going to take my word for this as being good, or even the Bible's word. You're going to rely on your own experience. And I can guarantee you, if you'll try this for 3 months, you'll never go back. It's kind of like when a slave is freed from bondage, they never willingly go back and put on chains again. Choose one day per week that will be your Sabbath. Many of us will choose Sunday, but not all of us. I mean, a minister can't choose Sunday. That's like the last day of the week as our Sabbath. So many of us, myself included, take Monday as our Sabbath. For you, it might be Saturday. The point is not which day of the week, but the fact that you've found one, you've chosen it. It's a day that you can regularly turn to as this is the Sabbath day, playing and praying, worshiping, giving thanks, getting together with friends, opening a bottle of wine, going to a Huskers game. That actually counts. You can do that. You have fun, getting together with friends, right? And then protect that day. You make sure you keep it planned for that day in your week. Schedule your week around that day. Also protect it from all your friends who will not understand why you're not getting involved in all the busy work they want to involve you with, right? I actually, being as a minister, I take my Sabbath on a Monday. I actually had to really discipline myself because my wife Melanie works on Monday and then I don't. And it's not because of any expectations she placed on me, but I had this expectation, like she'd come home from a hard day of work. Oh, what did you do, honey? Oh, what did you do? Well, I balanced the checkbook, and God, what else? Maybe I cleaned the house, and I felt like I had to come up with all this busy work. It's like, no, it's the opposite. If you're going to brag about what you did on the Sabbath, say, I had so much fun. And then your spouse gives you an angry look and said, but I did it for the Lord. Because I did it for the Lord, it's really about I'm doing it for you, honey. Right? Okay, don't try that one. But the point is, though, you really do have to protect that day. People won't understand. They're going to, and also you need to protect it for others. If people are trying to take their Sabbath, you want to make sure you help them protect that day. Third, don't be too rigid. All of us mess up. We all, get involved with, various amounts of busy work, what have you. And there's also seasonality. There's sometimes, if you're working the salmon cannery in Alaska in the summer, there is no Sabbath you're going to take. So there's some seasonality to this. Don't be so rigid that following the Sabbath causes you more stress in life rather than less, right? If you mess up, know that God is a God of grace and abundant grace. Give yourself a break. Certainly God is willing to do that. And then finally, don't be so enamored by God's abundant grace that you don't take it seriously and get too lax. Basically saying, hey, anything goes. This is Sabbath work. No, you need to take it seriously because the Sabbath is meant to be a holy day. It's sacred time. So to the extent possible, you don't want to mess with that. You want to let it mess with you. Because by following the Sabbath, taking that 24 hours each week and devoting it to having fun, playing and praying, you send out a signal every week to God, the universe, life itself, and to your own soul that the world truly does not depend upon you and what you do. That it's okay to let go and let the world work on its own for a bit. A signal that you can take into the rest of your week too, like, oh, life doesn't revolve all around me. I can relax a little bit. I can actually take time maybe enjoy the rest of my week a bit more than I have. You also send up a signal to God, the universe, life itself, and to you. Yes, I do want to receive the blessings that you intend for me. That's ultimately what Sabbath keeping is about. Opening our lives, opening our souls, opening our time to receiving something, not simply doing and giving something. So if you want to send up that signal for the next 3 months, I'm willing to receive the blessings that you intend for me. Try that. And see at the end of the 3 months whether you want to go back to the old ways or not. Amen.